Hello and welcome to another episode of CollectaThoughts. Today we're going to be talking about House of Ashes, the third game in the Dark Pictures anthology and also the penultimate game. This being a series of modernly short horror games with a focus on linear story and choice making. And I'll start by immediately saying that I'm not a huge fan of this anthology. As someone who quite enjoyed Until Dawn, it does feel like this new series is a bit lackluster, or in a lot of ways revealing to the actual qualities of this developer, which sounds mean and kinda is, but hopefully I'll make myself understandable within this review. First, let's talk about what is House of Ashes, and here the story follows some military people during the Iraq War, as our main characters find an ancient temple that, you guessed it, is haunted, and your main goal is to survive. And honestly, the setup is interesting, but I think it doesn't really fit this genre of storytelling. It works for movies where they invest you into the characters and you want them to survive, and it's up to them, so to say, obviously it's fiction, to do so. For example, a good movie that has a very similar plot to this game is The Descent, which centers about a group of women stuck inside a cave with some monsters and trying to survive. Very similar to this one, which has a group of military people stuck inside this temple, also trying to survive against monsters. The problem is, the moment you give me the player control, in this type of game, it really feels like either everyone lives or you got the bad ending, which I don't think anyone would ever say about a movie. The reason for this is also to do with how the game is built, at least in this anthology and the other games by this company, but to be fair, this is a very widespread thing, and I'll try and explain why I think it is in a bit, but what I'm talking about is, in games like this, there is no self-sacrifice. There is no dying for a reason. There is no tough choices in terms of who survives and who doesn't. We're in that situation where, once again, it really feels like the scenario where most people survive is the only good one. Characters rarely die out of choice, mostly coming down to failed quick time events. And there's various reasons for that. The main one, I think, is creating multiple paths for the game. In this type of game, regardless of who survives, the main storyline is always about the same. The only real thing changing is who is around to say an extra line of dialogue or something like that. The other problem is that for most players and the developers working on the game, it is very easy to see through the facade of the choice. Obviously, most players will try to succeed, and so they will pick the successful options where everyone survives once again. And so I think that developers try to steer in this way with some really obvious choices. Like, for example, if you're holding on to someone and they're on the verge of falling to their deaths or something like that, obviously you'll choose to keep holding on. They try to trick you here by making it look like if you don't let go, we'll both die. This is a very common scenario in this type of game. But the problem is the player, if it's trying to survive, will always pick to try and save everyone, since you can't really convey the idea of how hard it is to lift someone up in that specific situation, for example. In a medium full of superhuman characters that can defy the laws of physics, it's often quite hard to depict them as weak or as incapable. And this game definitely doesn't help itself by making the main characters, military people, which you'd hope are in peak physique. But even taking that aside, given that it is a problem that affects quite a lot of games, not just this one, there is also the problem that the story must always move forward. This game will never just give you a game over because there's no more characters left unless you legitimately let everyone die, which would still take a few hours to reach a position where you could even do that in this game, which creates a situation where the game itself is afraid to let you fail, making you also care less for these characters and the story overall, because the stakes are so reduced, I think. An example for this in this game is early on, there's a scene where you're put in the situation of either one person dies or both die, it seems. But the reality of the choice is that either one person dies or both survive. The reason for this is because in that specific scene, it's supposed to be a scenario where you think a character dies but they come back later. That character will always look like she died, so she can come back later as part of the plot. The problem with that is it creates that situation where I as a player thought I could save them both, not knowing that the way to do that would be just to let the first one die. The game also does a thing that I think is not so great here, which is a hint that that is a possibility after you don't let go of this character, let them go to their death. It still gives you a choice again to hold on. In retrospect, that was the clue that I was supposed to let go, but in the moment it seemed like the game was just testing me to see if I would actually keep holding on to this person. And honestly, this is probably still one of the best moments of this game because of that. But the problem is that again, that first character must always seem like it's going to die. That scenario must always happen regardless of your choices. Once again, because this is a very linear game that follows a very linear plot that regardless of who survives and dies, needs to reach a certain point. And I think that from a player perspective, the biggest problem with this isn't so much the moment it happens, but when it happens later on and makes you realize the facade of the choice, immediately diminishing your perception of how much you're actually affecting the story. Of course, playing a lot of these games makes you a lot more perceptive of this, but I do think that the best games in this genre do very well with faking the perception of choice, even though overall the game may be very simple in the structure of its story and its story paths, I think Until Dawn did this fairly well, for example, mostly because it was more focused on a serial killer in a smaller area, and also because the young adults in that game were, not very smart, the type you would expect to see in a slasher movie. So when they got themselves in situations where they would die, it felt more believable, so to say. Also, because they were, stupid young adults and they sounded like them, the awkward writing also felt more normal, so to say. It also helped that they had probably a better cast in this game. I'm trying not to be mean here, but the writing here is legitimately bad. It does feel very awkward, and the way people talk doesn't feel real at all. The way people interact is like you're just trying to set things up for the plot, and this isn't actually a character that exists, not really a believable character. An example for this is actually the new character that is voiced and acted, I guess, by Ashley Tisdale, which odd choice to get some really old Disney actress, but she's getting work. Good for her, I guess. Regardless, she plays a character that is having an affair, but her affair doesn't really feel real in any way. It just feels like it's setting up a moment later to create this indecision for the character. Which leads me to the other problem. Any kind of indecision between characters or likeness and dislikeness between them is very, once again, fake, because even though a character may or may not like another one, it doesn't really matter if you're gonna, at the end of the day, control all of them and their choices. Once again, I don't think this was such a big of a problem in Until Dawn, because I do feel like that the drama between these characters felt like it was a lot more out of your hands and up to the story and who survived, and they left the surviving up to you, which I think works better. But it also suffers from this. I'm not saying that Until Dawn is perfect and it should be the standard for this type of games, so just be aware of that. But yeah, it just doesn't really work. They put you in situations where you can be like, play as one character and say that you like them, and then when you play as the other character, say that you like them back, and then clap, you're a writer now. It just doesn't work, I think. And that's kind of a big problem when I don't really have anything else to grab onto with this game. I can't grab onto the characters. I'm not very interested in the overall plot. I find the choices to be very inconsequential once again. I surely ain't in it for the gameplay, walking around slowly and looking at objects once in a while, followed by quick time events that are not particularly good either. And the kicker, the game isn't scary. It is by far the least scary of the anthology. It was insanely obvious what the weakness of the monsters were very early on in the game, and it was really annoying that none of the characters realized it. Or if they did realize it, they definitely never made any choices based on it. Honestly, I'm ashamed to admit how often I droned off, and that led me to fail QTEs in this game. I just really was not interested this time around. At least Little Hope had a bit of an interesting, weird plot going for it, and Man of Medan had more of those slasher type of idiot adults. You know what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about real people, I'm talking about characters. But anyways, that's really the gist of it. I didn't really have anything of value to grab onto with this story, and for it, I was just legitimately bored while playing this. Now, to move on to a more technical side of this game, graphically it does look good, but it also doesn't look very interesting. I think the caves make for a very bland setting. It is just a bunch of rocks for the most of it, and even when you reach temple areas, it is also just kind of eh. And also, I think we're kind of reaching a bit of an uncanny valley with graphics, where some aspects are really good, and because of it, the aspects that are not as good do kind of stand out. For me here, it was just kind of how characters looked and moved, felt very artificial compared to the graphic qualities of everything else, which honestly, I do think it actually makes this game probably age better, because once the things like lighting and texture resolution, texture quality do inevitably age, at least they'll match the animations of the game as well. But playing this in current year, it did feel odd. It did feel like the lighting, for example, was noticeably good, while the characters' faces was often awkward. Especially the eyes. We still haven't really gotten the eyes down in video games. Maybe it's just one of those things where the eyes is where you look at in a person, and so that's where you focus the most, and it's easier to notice, it not being real. Which is, I guess fair enough. Regardless though, yeah, that's about it. It looks good on a technical level. Pretty good, especially for the budget, I'm guessing. It isn't the best looking game ever. Clearly it's just running on a slightly improved version of the Until Dawn engine, which, while very impressive when it came out, it's also been over 6 years since that game came out, so it is normal if it isn't gonna be top of the line, especially on this game's budget being, smaller. Now, soundtrack and audio-wise, I'll be honest, not even in Until Dawn, I wasn't a particularly huge fan of the sound design of these games. I think they depend too much on that high-sting jump scare sound, a bit too often to the point where it's lost all its meaning. Once again, while I didn't like it in Until Dawn, it did make more sense there because it did feel like a slasher B movie. But here, once again, that's not really what I'm getting out of this story. Honestly, playing this whole anthology so far has been making me think that Until Dawn was very much a fluke of everything was just kind of in the right place at that moment, picking the right story for the type of strength that this developer has. Because I think if Until Dawn had been an 8-hour game about some soldier dudes stuck in a cave, I don't think it would have had the same reception even as a PlayStation exclusive at the time. And not so much for that reason, I don't really care if this game would have been very popular 5 years ago, but for all the other reasons that I gave while explaining this game, which I think I did ramble on a bit about kind of this type of game and the problems with creating false choices or trying to fool the player in such a way and kind of failing at it. It would be fine if they didn't fail, lie to me, but do it well. This is for games, not for real life. Just be aware of that. Regardless, Dark Pictures Anthology, The House of Ashes, is getting a 4 out of 10. It is a pretty low score, despite this game being fairly competent as far as a game is. It works. I don't think you're gonna be mad at it from a very technical standpoint. But also, I was bored out of my mind playing it. I felt like the twists were super obvious. I felt like the characters were never doing anything particularly interesting while they were trying to survive. It was like they were just walking around in a cave for 5 hours, while random monsters would show up once in a while. At least Little Hope had this more interesting story that kinda melded different time periods into a kind of weird thriller mystery. Even if that didn't work, at least it was something different. Meanwhile, here you get an introduction of how this monster supposedly showed up right at the beginning, and then that's it. You're just like, okay, here's the monsters, they're gonna try and kill you. Which maybe it works for some people. For me, I was just, again, bored is the word of the day. I was really bored playing this. And recommendations wise, I wouldn't recommend it. Maybe if you liked Man of Medan and Little Hope, if you unironically really liked both of those games, then sure, I think you'll enjoy this. But if you didn't like Man of Medan or Little Hope, I do think that this is definitely not going to be the one that changes your mind, despite it seeming like it is the best rated one review-wise so far. Which I honestly think it's mostly just a retention thing. You know how like in IMDb sequels and later seasons for shows are higher rated because usually the people who liked those were people that liked what was before, and people who didn't like it simply stopped engaging with that specific content, which I think is probably what's happening here. People who didn't like the first two games are probably not coming back to play House of Ashes, even if it gets good reviews. Now, in the situation that you're new to this Dark Pictures anthology, my first question would be, have you played Until Dawn? And if so, play that. But that is also a PlayStation exclusive, so maybe you don't have a PlayStation, so that's fine. I do think in that case you could give one of them a try, and in that case I would probably recommend still Little Hope out of the three. I'd still do think that's the most interesting and best one in terms of a story, even if it still very much suffers from all the problems I have with this game that I addressed here. But yeah, personally I think you're better off trying something else. Regardless though, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, disliking, all the things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope that the next one is better. I mean it. That being said, I don't know if I'm gonna even play it. But regardless of any of that, goodbye.